Hello, everyone. Welcome to the Revolution 250 podcast. I'm Bob Allison. I chair the Rev 250 Advisory Group. We are a consortium of about 75 groups in Massachusetts planning ways to commemorate the beginnings of American independence. Our guest today is Cynthia Hatch. Dr. Cynthia Hatch is an instructor at the Oklahoma State University Institute of Technology, where she actually specializes in the history of the Revolutionary War. And her book, Enablers of Rebellion, the Colonial Court System and the Road to the American Revolution, is going to be available in July of 2026. So Cynthia, thank you so much for joining us.
Good morning. Thank you so much for having me.
And your book does deal with a very interesting topic, the role of colonial courts in the build-up to the revolution and their responses to various episodes. And I'm not going to give it all away, but it has a really wonderful episode that I think very few people know much about, which is the Pine Tree Riot of 1772. So can you tell us a bit about what this was and why it's important?
Yeah. So the Pine Tree Riot really deals with, I think, the topic of possession. When you look at the law and you look at what constitutes possession under the law, this particular situation was definitely being dealt with. To go back even a little bit further, though, you have the Pine Tree Acts of 1708 and 1711 that constitute this kind of legal framework to where the crown is unable to be able to have these trees, which go into making the ship masts. So if you think about, if you're obscuring the king being able to have these masts, are you in fact actually damaging the Royal Navy? I think there's some question in terms of that. So by the time you get into the 1770, there's more, the broadsides are being put up that basically, hey, these mills in New Hampshire are taking trees that should actually go to the crown. And like, look, you can't do this. In one newspaper, there's actually a list of all of the lumber mills that are actually responsible for these actions, which, if you think about it, putting all of these businesses and naming them, not only just the names, but also like the owners of the mill in a public forum like that, that could lead to a lot of resentment. I mean, just off, human nature being what it is.
So Cynthia, just so if we can just slow down a minute.
Yeah.
So the mills are taking trees that belong to the crown. So who is actually posting this information? Is it the crown side or the mill side?
Yeah, so the crown has issued different legal warnings, basically, whether they're broadsides, whether they're being printed in the local newspapers, especially in Connecticut, but New Hampshire specifically. And it's the crown essentially warning lumber mills and those, in that sphere, you cannot take these trees. Right. You can't take the lumber and keep it for yourself. So that's where, when I was talking about the idea of possession, right. Well, whose trees are they? Because one of the questions is, why are we giving the best lumber to the crown? We've grown it here. We've, basically they've harvested it. They've kept it. They're treating it. Why are we giving it away when technically this is ours?
Yeah, that's an interesting question, because of course the colonies have been, like New Hampshire, have been started to get this lumber for the Royal Navy. So then the colonists are saying, no, actually it's ours because we're here.
Yeah, there gets to be a little bit of resentment about why are we giving away the best lumber when why? And I think that's one of the things that I've come across in research is just there tends to be a question about whose is it really? Granted, the law stipulates what it was, and like you just said, New Hampshire was set up, to harvest all of these trees, but as time goes on, and you've got things like the French and Indian War, which is at this point obviously history at that point, but we're moving into an era of taxation. We're moving into an era where the crown is becoming more heavy-handed. So there tends to be a little bit of a resentment, a questioning of what's really happening here. 1770, like I said, the survey of the King's Forests puts out this, he puts out this rather scathing newspaper article, and it says, who's responsible for it, and lists everything. And I think at that point, that's a really big issue, because now you're naming names and you're putting them in a public forum and you're actually accusing people of crimes, because it's not just okay, you're taking the lumber and you're keeping it for yourself. You're violating legislation put out by Parliament. You're violating local laws that have been put in place specifically to protect the king's wood, the king's lumber. So that's a little bit of a tipping point in 1770. By the time you get into 1772, this conversation has already gone on for quite some time, and there's been a lot of, I think, based upon the court records, it sounds like there's been a lot of things that have been brought up, within the legal system, without of the legal system, in the newspapers, kind of that public fight about, well, what is this? Why are we doing this? By the time you get into the spring of 1772, warrants are being issued for the arrests of people. And this is what happens in Ware, New Hampshire. So Ebenezer Mudgett, he owns the mill there in town, and he's served with an arrest warrant. And this is where, reading the documentation, just red flags go off in your head, right? Like you're reading it and you're like, well, that doesn't make sense. Why would you do that? So they serve Ebenezer Mudgett at Aaron Quimby's Inn, otherwise known as the Pine Tree Inn in Ware, New Hampshire. And they serve him with this arrest warrant at night. And okay, so you're serving an arrest warrant at a bar at night. And then basically the conversation is, well, we'll deal with it in the morning. Okay, that just does not make sense to me. Just looking at it just from the standpoint of knowing our laws and how things theoretically work, that just didn't make sense. So that night, Ebenezer Mudgett, he ends up getting a whole group of men together at this inn where Benjamin Whiting, the sheriff Benjamin Whiting, and Quimby, the deputy, are staying that night. So they're going to stay at the inn that night. They've had dinner. They've served this arrest warrant. They go off to their room. Sometime in the wee hours of the night, a bunch of men break in. Now I say a bunch because there's been numbers of anywhere between like 5 and 9 and like 25 and 40. So I can tell you there's only about 9 people listed in the court documents. So I think that's probably a safe assumption. But even if you say somewhere around that number, they break into this room. And according to the court documents, they beat both the sheriff and the deputy within an inch of their life. So the rule of thumb that was used was that for every tree that they were accused of stealing, they were beating these men.
My goodness.
So I'm assuming that they were accused of a lot of theft.
So Mudgett, were there other people arrested? I mean, was Mudgett, you say that he served the arrest warrant at the tavern, but then presumably he goes off, or had they locked him up?
No. So they basically said that they were going to deal with him the next day.
Okay. So then he goes up and gets the guys together, and they go beat up the sheriff, and
they go assault the sheriff and the deputy, which if if you look at it from the standpoint of their proxy for the king, they're doing the king's work.
Oh, yeah.
Are you then assaulting the crown? I mean, that's a question. So they, Ebenezer Mudgett, he goes and he gets this, group of men. Nothing really happens with the arrest warrant for Mudgett. It ends up being the arrest warrant and the subsequent trial for these 9 guys and Ebenezer Mudgett, which it just seems like the court kind of missed the mark in terms of that particular case dealing with solely just the lumber. That really wasn't dealt with, which I've again, if you look at the way that, the court systems typically work, if you've been served with a warrant and there's an intent to be arrested, how are you not fulfilling that line of judicial justice, if you will? And instead, all the attention gets turned to this assault, which is understandable, but at the same point, what happened to the lumber? Like that, like they just kind of forgot about it. And there's no court records for that, which again defies some logic in terms of like, well, how did that happen and why did it happen? So as the court case kind of is formulated against what happened at the inn, you do. So they beat the sheriff and the deputy pretty bad. They also assaulted. cropped the ears of their horses, bloodied them.
Wow.
And then as the sheriff and the deputy are riding away, you have to imagine, given the description in the court papers, the two men are bloodied, they're beaten, their horses are bloodied and beaten.
Right.
So they ride away in hopes of basically finding help and then returning to the inn.
Right. Yeah.
And when they return to the inn, there's nobody there.
Wow. Right. Yeah.
Right. They're all gone.
Amazing. So
yeah,
we're talking with Cynthia Hatch, whose book is Enablers of Rebellion, the Colonial Court System and the Road to the American Revolution, which looks at this period, 1772 to 1774. And we've been talking about this episode in Ware, New Hampshire, with the Pine Tree Riot, when the sheriff and the deputy are attacked by this group who were angry because Ebenezer Mudgett had been arrested for taking trees that belong to the crown, and they're assaulting then the crown's agents. And then what happens, Cynthia?
So eventually they end up going to court. They are put through the judicial system, and you would assume that there would be a pretty hefty fine associated with it. It's 20 shillings.
Wow.
Congratulations, it's 20 shillings. Go on your way. And that in and of itself defies all logic in terms of what probably should have happened, given the severity. I mean, if this had been after the coercive acts, could it have been, manipulated into a charge of treason? Probably, given the proxy of the sheriff and the deputy. So I think that there's some error there in the judicial system and just the way that it was running at that point in time, with how the court system was handled.
And then you see, I mean, in your book, you look at other episodes like this, and the next big one, you have a chapter on the Gaspee riot in Rhode Island. But let me ask before we go on, there are three big examples you have are New England. Do you see anything similar happening in, say, Virginia or North Carolina with this kind of attacks on crown agents that are then unpunished by juries?
There are some. They're not nearly quite this exacerbated in terms of just like how it was not dealt with, if you will. Yeah, there's definitely some other examples. I chose to focus primarily in New Hampshire and then Rhode Island, given the proximity of time, but also just how closely in physical distance they were.
Right. Is there much connection, by the way, between people in New Hampshire that the folks in Rhode Island know about the Pine Tree Riot when they attacked the Gaspee?
Yeah, there's nothing that conclusively says there's a connection, but you have to think, given the proximity and distance, that there would have known what was going on. You also have the newspapers that had come out listing all of the people. I think there would have been discussion about it.
Right.
I don't necessarily believe that the Pine Tree Riot instigated the Gaspee in any way, but I think that it definitely helped kind of build this foundation of resentment towards the crown.
You were saying earlier, before we got on, that both you and your husband can trace ancestors to both sides of this episode. Yeah,
which was just a serendipitous find, if you will, because I just couldn't believe that was the case. His is William Dustin, mine is Aaron Quimby, and I was like, oh, look at that. Who knew? Wow. And they're both in the court case, which was kind of neat.
Wow. Interesting. So let's move to Rhode Island then, because the Gaspee, of course, is a big event, and it does trigger kind of a bigger response from the crown. But what happens actually in the legal proceedings in Rhode Island?
Yeah, so the Gaspee happens 8 weeks after the Pine Tree Riot. So there's, in terms of the court, well, one of the things that I actually did, and I'm just going to back up just a second, in the second chapter, I kind of highlight and profile a lot of the people involved, because when you start understanding how interconnected this area really was, you start understanding that there would have been talk. There would have been kind of this underlying understanding of what else was going on and some of the implications of the events that ensued. So when you get to the Gaspee, 2 months later, and the Gaspee is, you've got Lieutenant Duddingston, which, I love the way he is described in some of these letters. He is the ultimate, he is what made, tax collectors or customs officials given the bad name. Right. He would steal things. He would steal people's hogs, and he would take things, and not somebody you really wanted to be around. And he was just very kind of, not a pleasant fella, if you will. So he ends up chasing the Hannah up the river and gets stuck on a sandbar. And by the time that the people who had given chase in the Hannah get into Providence, there's a lot of conversation about what do we do with this ship? What do we do with Duddingston? Because something should happen to him. And here's where I find it interesting. In Sabin's Tavern, this is where they were meeting. They were, banging the drum, the hateful ship Gatsby. We're going to do something, right? So they're gaining all of this support at Sabin's Tavern. Well, in the next room, a bunch of judges are having dinner, which I find interesting. Like, how did you miss the mark that something nefarious was happening, right? So they go on, they make this plan, they end up rowing out to the Gatsby. And through the course of events, Lieutenant Duddingston is shot in the abdomen, lower abdomen. His crew was taken captive, and the ship is burned to the waterline. So again, you've taken Crown officials, and you've not only potentially, the damage that could have been done to Duddingston, he could have died from it had it not been for a local surgeon who was there to be able to perform surgery on him and remove at least a good portion of the bullet. There's evidence to say that there's pieces that had remained and caused him like lifelong damage in his legs and things. But you shoot the captain, you burn the ship, and you take the crew. Well, that is some pretty serious charges that should have happened. Not only that, the person leading the charge is John Brown, prominent figure in Providence, in Rhode Island. So people knew who the responsible party was, and somehow they kept their mouths shut and didn't say anything, which I find mind-boggling. There's some talk here and there. One person tries to come forward, but in the grand scheme of things, the Crown ends up issuing rewards, not just one, but several, and they keep upping the ante in terms of the amount. And nobody comes forward to say this is the responsible party and they've got evidence or eyewitness accounts. There's lots of people who were there. So how did that fall through the cracks? And really nothing happened, which, again, if a group of judges are having dinner, that there's people who were present. The whole town knew that, something was going on. And you have several dozen people who have rowed out to the Gatsby to burn it and to injure the, Lieutenant Duddingston. So the fact that nothing happened from it and that everybody somehow managed to stay quiet about who was actually responsible is shocking. Again, given human nature and the way people talk, I can't imagine a whole community staying silent on what had actually happened.
Well, it's something that's unimaginable unless, of course, you're in one of these communities with this omerta, this code of silence, and the fact that they don't. And we saw this in 1765 with various stamp riots over non-importation in Rhode Island. It's really an interesting thing to look at from that standpoint. So you can't get justice in Rhode Island. Is there a response then from the Crown about these courts, either in New Hampshire or Rhode Island, that won't actually punish people who are doing these outrageous things?
Yeah, and I think the subtext of it is these judges all knew each other. They were all, in the same circles and would have had knowledge about what else was going on, even if there was an air of privacy or secrecy about something. There definitely would have been conversation about what was ensuing.
They knew these guys in the next room too, who were, to launch this attack. It's an amazing story. It really is an amazing story about this. And too often we draw this line between, the Patriots and the Tories, not seeing these communities. Really, people do know each other, and you're on that ground. So folks would have known the sheriff in New Hampshire who they're beating up, and the deputy. And what about? Let's talk about. Go back to New Hampshire then to talk a little bit about Fort William and Mary, because then we are getting to this moment really of resistance, and Paul Revere goes to, because General Gage is sending troops to get the weapons out. But so that's often how we tell this story, but you're seeing it as part of this other context of the Pine Tree Riot, the Gatsby.
Well, I think Fort William and Mary is interesting because it just seems like General Gage missed the mark. It's hard to say. There's circumstantial kind of evidence to prove that, he just didn't see it being as big of a deal as it actually was, which I don't know how you come to that conclusion. Because by the time he actually sends reinforcements to New Hampshire, it's too late. Everybody's gone. The powder's gone. There's nobody left. So, was it a case that, he just basically didn't think that it was as serious as it was? But then I guess let me back up and actually tell what happened. Right. So December 1774, Paul Revere arrives in town, and he specifically is giving a dispatch in terms of, hey, you need to deal and obtain all the powder from Fort William and Mary because of events that have already happened, right? So you've got, the events that have happened in Boston with the powder, some of these other situations had already come to light. So it's not like there's not a context for the urgency of it. There absolutely is. So Paul Revere, he meets Samuel Cutts in town. They discuss it. Samuel Cutts tries to get everybody together that night. He just can't get it together. It's kind of too short of notice. But for the following day, John Langdon and a group of people go out to the fort, meet out at the fort, and poor John Cochran, the officer in charge, he was warned by Governor Wentworth that, something be on the lookout, right? But I make this point that if you genuinely think that there's going to be a hostile environment and that your fort is going to be raided, how did you not get other troops over at the fort? There were five people. That's a skeletal crew. There's no way to defend that. And if you think about, the fort, it's supposed to be a fortified structure and all of these things, but 5 people, there's no way to defend that. It's just not. So if you really thought, as John Wentworth, as the governor, that something was going to happen, he failed by not sending more reinforcements at that time of the warning, or at least having, at least some other protections put in place. Nothing was done. So by the time John Langdon and that group get out to the fort, they're overrunning the fort altogether. I mean, there's a part in there where if you read the depositions from this period, they're fascinating because not only are the depositions telling exactly what's going on, sorry, I was just trying to read the comment there. The depositions detail exactly what was happening, but they also name drop everybody who was involved. So again, how are you going through this whole system of depositions and, a judicial recourse when you have everybody's name and you know exactly who everybody is and nothing happens? I think that's an interesting angle to look at. So they get out there, they end up overrunning the fort. John Cochran's wife is there. She eventually says to her husband, "Would you like me to get your pistols?" As a direct quote. And I'm just thinking, this poor guy, did you not see what was coming? You've been warned. Now you have people at your doorstep. And your wife is going, "Honey, you need your rifle, or you need your handgun." Your pistols, so it's a little, I think that's, there's a little bit of irony there. The next day, John Sullivan comes back with another group and unloads even more. So at this point, by the end of the event, they've got the King's cannon, they've got all the black powder, they've taken everything that they basically could, and they have moved it to the interior of New Hampshire. Eventually, these, the black powder and the various different ammunitions will be used in other subsequent fights. Siege of Boston makes an appearance. So I think that this particular event, it really demonstrates where the crown, whether you're talking about the judicial system under the crown or you're talking about the royal governor, really fall flat being able to exercise any kind of authority over the situation. Like I said, by the time Gage ends up sending reinforcements, it's too late. Everything's gone. And eventually what you'll see is Governor Wentworth loses all support and doesn't bring any charges.
It's interesting, and Jonathan had made the point in the comments that the reinforcements that Cochrane would have called would have been the militia, and those actually are the guys now who are attacking the fort. So that's. Do you think Gage and Wentworth just didn't see this coming? That the fact that there was going to be this really mobilized, organized resistance that was going to be able to get the powder out of there before Gage's forces could go and take it?
Yeah, I think Wentworth is an interesting person, just because I really think that he didn't assume the people in his colony were as agitated as they actually were.
Right. Yeah.
Which I don't understand how you come to that conclusion. I don't know if it's naivety. I don't know if it's he just doesn't want to see the writing on the wall, so to speak, that there's actually problems. The fact that you've got Paul Revere riding into town already is kind of a known entity of like, basically if Paul Revere shows up, chances are something is amiss. How he missed that, I'm not really sure. It almost seems like he didn't want to admit that things were going as poorly as that they were going to go. And in terms of General Gage, he just seemed like he didn't understand exactly how fragile the situation was in New Hampshire. And again, maybe General Gage was going off of what John Wentworth was telling him. If Wentworth actually thought things were okay, I may have a couple of people who are unhappy, but for the most part, New Hampshire is loyal to the crown. Perhaps Gage looked at that as like, well, I don't really need to worry about it until you raid the fort and take everything.
Right. Yeah. So he hadn't really learned anything from the Pine Tree episode where the juries, basically, 20 shillings for beating up the sheriff. Didn't see that as a harbinger of what could happen next.
Yeah, and the interesting thing about that is the Chief Justice in that particular court case in the Pine Tree riot is actually Governor Wentworth. By the time we get into the situation with Fort William and Mary, it's his uncle. So when you look at like the family connections, you know that there had to have been conversation.
Yeah.
Like I have to assume, based on just, people being able to talk in those situations, you would have known that there would have been problems. But again, did Governor Wentworth just assume that things were really just not that bad because he didn't want to see it? I don't know.
It's interesting. And you wonder, just as you wonder with which comes first, a person having that nasty disposition and becoming a tax collector, or tax collector develops that disposition, were they just so inured? I mean, the Wentworths had been there for a couple of generations at this time, and people know us. I think Governor Hutchinson had much the same feeling, but then he had a rude awakening in the mid 1760s when his house is attacked by a mob. So we never think it's going to happen to us, I think, is part of it.
Yeah. And that's probably like the best way to put it, is just because I just don't think that he assumed that it was going to happen to him. Yeah. And that's a dangerous position to be in when things are unraveling as quickly as they are, because it only took one event for things to turn sideways in some instances.
Interesting. Yeah. Now, so we're talking with Cynthia Hatch, whose book is Enablers of Rebellion, the Colonial Court System and the Road to the American Revolution, really looking at this period from 1772 to 74, and these episodes in New England that are portents of something happening. Does the more distant, folks looking at this from England see this differently? Do they see, boy, these places really are out of control? There's no way of getting a handle on this because the local courts aren't doing their job and the sheriffs are getting beaten up. We really need to do something.
Yeah, the Colonial Court, or the colonial newspapers in England at this point, there's some of them from Edinburgh and from not so much in London that I've found, but some of the outside areas in the kingdom that actually show some support for what's going on from the American side, which I think is
they say the Americans are right. They should be attacking sheriffs.
Yeah, which I think is an interesting take, just because if you're looking at it basically from the outside, if you're in Scotland, you probably don't feel like you have too much, stake in the situation. But if you're looking at it and you're finding yourself agreeing, that just makes me question, okay, well, what issues are you agreeing with? Because some of the newspapers basically just state flat out support. Other of them just, we're with our brothers in America kind of sentiment. But, I kind of have to wonder how much of that is based upon the foundational English documents that create the system of law that exists. Because if you're looking at taxation, if you're looking at some of these things that violate, the Magna Carta or, the Petition of Right or any of these other documents, it does lend itself to be questioned about what the Crown is actually doing and how it's choosing to achieve its goals.
Interesting, yeah. And we do see Magna Carta being used in a lot of the colonial propaganda, that is the patriot propaganda. And of course, the figure of John Wilkes looms very large. So this connection with these English radicals, British radicals, with this American cause, you can see this political connection fostering. Does anyone in London see this? And I mean, they're worried about Wilkes and so on. Do they see the Americans as Wilkites who are going to help overturn the monarchy?
Yeah, I mean, I think there is some sentiment. I don't think it's put out nearly as in the forefront that some of the other newspapers in Scotland and some of these other areas are. You're definitely starting to see a shift in terms of, especially by the time you get to the Fort William and Mary event, the coercive acts had already been put in place. So I think you're starting to view what violations had been created by the crown to the American people, and that's starting to gain more and more traction. And that becomes a pretty bad situation for the king, just because if you're starting to have your own people are starting to notice that you're violating the things that basically keep you in power.
Right.
How do you keep that? Yeah. That's basically a problem.
It's fascinating. So what led you to this particular book project, Cynthia?
I started researching the Pine Tree Riot a number of years ago, and the more that I found out about it, the more it just defied logic to me. And the more that I kind of, researched around it and found situations like the Gaspee, like Fort William and Mary, that were left basically, they kind of walked away from it. Nothing happened. Yeah. And that just absolutely floored me and surprised me in a way that, especially given the context of, there's this idea that the British crown and that the parliament really came down heavy on Americans, and they did. But this defied that position. And I didn't understand how it's possible that, one, we don't have a grasp on any of these situations. Yeah. I'd say that the Gaspee is probably the best known out of the three events. Yeah. But the Pine Tree Riot is largely left unresearched. There's some great court documents that I've used to kind of substantiate the claims in the book. But I think following along with the fact that there's events that happen that kind of go under the radar, and we don't understand the implications of them. Because I think when you look at these three events and the lack of consequence, does it propel even further ideas of rebellion? Does it give credence to being able to then, well, the crown's not going to punish you if you do this, or if they do, it's only 20 shillings. Don't worry about it. Yeah. And those kinds of ideas, I think, are really important, because as resentment continues to grow and to boil, I think what we notice is, there's a slow burn, and these are part of it.
Yeah, you say that the risk is greater than the reward is greater than the risk for people doing these things. Do you think if, say, the New Hampshire judges had come down harder on the Pine Tree rioters, then you would not have gotten to Fort William and Mary being such an easy place to take, or you could have averted this crisis that comes in 74, 75?
Yeah, I think like anything, it's hard to tell, but I think that it would have helped the case for the crown, excuse me, not to look weak. Right. And if you look weak and you are not fulfilling your duties, it only is going to lead to resentment and to the position that you need to be removed. I think that they, looking, all things being equal, I think that the Pine Tree Riot, they should have probably gone through the court system in regards to Ebenezer Mudgett as a separate issue. The fact that this was all kind of rolled into one, it kind of just makes you question, how did that happen and why did it happen? Especially when the Chief Justice of the Superior Court, Theodore Atkinson, was related to Governor Wentworth. It seems like that would have been an opportunity for the crown to come in and be a little bit more staunch in terms of what the repercussions were going to be, and they weren't.
Interesting. We're talking with Cynthia Hatch, who is an instructor at the Oklahoma State University Institute of Technology and the author of Enablers of Rebellion, Colonial Court System, and the Road to the American Revolution. I just want to ask one kind of broader question at the end, because you had the luxury of spending about 20 years in Williamsburg, where it's relatively easy to get people engaged in and interested in the American Revolution. But now you've been teaching in Oklahoma, and I'm wondering, and you actually specialize in the period of the American Revolution. So I'm just wondering about motivating your students in Oklahoma to get as invested in this as we all should be.
Yeah, I think, trying to allow my students to see themselves in the story is really critical. I know, personally, I know what that did for me, being able to make my own personal connections. So anytime that I can kind of show and broaden the context of the war to kind of bring more people into the story, I definitely try to do. And I try to focus a lot on, some of the stories that maybe they don't know. I think that that's one way that trying to draw people in and make them understand that it's not as I say bland, but it's kind of like, K through 12 education, you only hit on certain things and then they get repeated. But when you can kind of expand that and show people, no, there's a complexity there that is wonderful and it's interesting and there's plenty of other people to study. I think that kind of, it sparks some interest. And I've definitely seen that as a result.
Well, thank you so much. That's really is, and you've engaged with these different stories, little known stories, which really we can see this differently because they're not the headline figures we've already heard about. So thank you. It's been great talking with you, Cynthia. Is there anything else we should add? Anything else you'd like to say before we let you go?
No, just thank you so much for having me on. I appreciate it and a chance to talk about my research.
This is great. It's great to hear about it. So thank you so much for sharing it. We've been talking with Cynthia Hatch, author of Enablers of Rebellion, the Colonial Court System, and the Roads of the American Revolution, due out in July of 2026. And so thank you so much for joining us, Cynthia. And I want to thank Jonathan Lane, our producer, the man behind the curtain, and our listeners. And every week, Cynthia, we thank folks who are regularly tuning in. And if you're in one of these places and want some of our Revolution 250 swag, send Jonathan an email, jlane@revolution250.org. And so this week, I want to thank our listeners here in Massachusetts, in Newton, Waltham, Hyde Park, Quincy, South Boston, and in the great state of Ohio, folks in Cincinnati, and Detroit and Inkster in the great state of Michigan, Barcelona, Pasadena, Maryland, South Pasadena, and San Diego in California, Red Hook, New York, and in Papayete in Polynesia, and Kuala Lumpur, and to all places between and beyond. Thank you for tuning in. And now we will be piped out on the road to Boston.